on the screen. There we go. That's us recording in progress. Hello, Michael. How are you?
I'm great, John. Thanks for having me back.
Good. It's John Touhy again, and I'm with Mike Hammond, retired homicide detective, Chicago PD. He holds his bachelor's in criminology from Indiana State University, and has lived in Chicago since what, the 80s, I guess, right, Mike?
Correct. Yes, sir.
I wanted to talk to you. I don't know if you ever ran across this guy, uh, maybe well before your time. Curtis Hanson was a guy, a goon, I'm told, that scared other gangs. Have you heard of this guy?
Yeah, I know quite a bit about Curtis Hanson, actually. Curtis Hanson was a horse guy, and he was part of what they deemed the horse mafia back in the days. There's another famous, really thug dude named Silas Jane who owned a bunch of horses and was involved in a lot of violence. And Curtis Hanson was actually connected with Frankie Schweich and Sam DiStefano, um, and sounds like he would do some independent work for them. He was a bad man, but the interesting thing about Curtis Hanson was, I don't know if you're aware of this, but we had a series no, it's in 1955 and then in 56, where in 1955, three boys, the Schuessler brothers and a
Oh, is
friend,
this the
Peter.
case of the three boys missing?
Correct. They were
I
found.
don't know a lot about it. I do know the guy who wrote the book. He's died now. Jimmy. Do you know him? Retired policeman.
Yeah, no, I don't recall it off the top of my head. I know
He wrote a
there
book
are
called
books
Three
written about it.
Boys Missing.
Yeah.
And apparently it is the first case where, in the history of criminology, I don't know why you should tell this, but where they figured out serial killers were working jointly, right?
Uh, I'm not familiar with that
Oh, no,
end of
no,
it.
no, that there was a serial killer. There was such a thing as a serial killer.
Yeah, I don't know about that. The thing about the Schussler Peterson murders was, they were found on the property, actually in a forest preserve on the northwest side of Chicago, but very near the property where Curtis Hanson had some horse stables. Um, they were nude when they were found dead, and they'd been assaulted, murdered.
These were
And
kids
it
in
was
10 years old or something.
they were, yeah, more like 14, 15 in that range, I think.
Oh.
Um, but it caused an amazing outroar at the time. But the case was cold for 40 years, basically. Um, the next year in 1956, there were two sisters on the south side. So if you're not from Chicago, this is not close at all in proximity. The Schuessler Peterson boys were found on the northwest side, and the Grime sisters went missing from. They went to a late show at the Brighton Park Theater, which is on Archer near Kedzie on the southwest side, near southwest side. Um, and they never showed up. They never came home. They were thought maybe they ran away, um, and their bodies were found about a month later, also nude, um, in a part of off of Old German Church Road out in unincorporated Cook County, kind of in the west suburbs. Uh, those murder that case caused an amazing, there's a lot of talk about these cases, a lot out there's a lot of YouTube stuff, there's a lot of books written about both cases. Most people that grew up during that time, that's before my time obviously, but they kind of point to these cases as Chicago's loss of innocence. People didn't lock
I
their
tell you,
doors.
I've not heard of the Grimm sisters, though.
Grime sisters. Yeah.
Grimes.
Mhm. Yeah, Patricia and Barbara Grimes, and they were like same 15 and 16, right in that range. And this really freaked the city out because people just let their kids play in the street. There
Mhm.
was the old axiom: just be home by the time the street lights come on.
Yeah.
Nobody locked their doors. But after this, the entire city was freaked out because the killers were never found in either case. And then a year later, in 1957, there was a 15-year-old girl named Judith Mae Anderson who was abducted and murdered, and her body was found floating in two sealed 55-gallon drums in the Montrose Harbor on the north side.
I missed the name. I'm sorry.
Judith Mae Anderson
Uh-huh.
was her name.
Yeah.
And she is not at all related, I don't believe. So we looked at my partner and I in cold case looked at these cases. We got assigned to look at Judith Mae Anderson because the Chicago Tribune was doing a 50th year anniversary of her death um, kind of article. And so this would have been 2007. And so it came down from on high to the cold case unit, like, hey, what do we got on this? Let's look into it. And we got assigned to look into it. Judith Mae Anderson was likely, almost certainly not related to the Grime sisters and the Schussler Peterson murders. But we did extensive work on Judith Mae Anderson, and we actually went to Houston, Texas, and got a DNA swab from a guy that is a potential suspect in that case. Unfortunately, the evidence was so deteriorated that we could not get anything to compare it to. But as it relates, though, that is just a timeline because the city of Chicago was kind of beside itself with anxiety over the murders of these young kids.
Yeah.
And what turned out to be true was first in the 1970s, Red Wimette started cooperating with the feds. And he actually mentioned, I think, in about 75 that he thought Curtis Hanson's brother, Kenneth Hanson, was involved with the Schussler Peterson boys. In fact, he said he may
Really?
have been. But they just had other things going. It really wasn't picked up on. But by the early 90s, mid 90s, they were going back over some of these things, and they were looking at an interesting side note to that was within a few days of the Schussler Peterson boys being found, Curtis Hanson's stables burned down. In what was called an accidental fire at the time, but then was later deemed to be arson. And by the 90s, I think it was Red, and you have some type of relationship with Red, or you've talked to him before, right? I mean,
Yeah, I like Red. Yeah.
yeah, he could give you more detail about this because he was involved in it. But basically, he had a statement from Kenneth Hanson that he had killed these boys, and then they had multiple. Once they started looking into it, and this is mainly ATF. When they started looking into it, they found that there had been stable boys who'd worked there over the years prior, who claimed that Hanson was a weird dude, and also he threatened them, "Hey, keep your mouth shut, or you're going to end up like those Peterson boys." So along the Chicago Police Department, Hanson is brought in. He's charged with the Schussler Peterson murders and convicted. It was eventually overturned, but he was retried on a technicality. But technicality, such a strange thing to say. But there was a reason the appellate court overturned it, not related to his guilt or innocence necessarily, but he was retried. He was found guilty again, and he died in prison. And that all becomes. There was always some talk that, wow, that's so similar to the Grime sisters in the way they were found, kind of the modus
Yeah.
operandi. But they're a long way away, and it just didn't seem like there was any way to connect them. And the Grime sisters thing was just a big, another huge story, because it's really interesting. They thought initially they'd run away. The Grime sisters, not to kind of paint them in a bad light, but they were kind of, there was talk that they were a little bit wild for the time, like, but I mean, is the mid 50s, right? So wild meant like they would sometimes take rides with boys in cars,
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you know, pretty innocent by today's standards, but
yeah.
they so it's thought that they had probably run away or were doing something. The mother was beside herself, and as far as I know, they have a sister that's still alive. She's in her 80s, so I want to be sensitive to her, respectful to her. But um, the they were big Elvis Presley fans, and they'd gone to see the late showing of the movie Love Me Tender, an Elvis movie. And this got so much press that Elvis himself actually recorded a bit for radio stations here in Chicago of him asking the girls to come home. Look, you know, nobody's
Really?
going to be mad at you. Please just come home, you know, see your family. This is Elvis asking, right? But they did not, of course. And let's see, I took some notes here. In January, so roughly a month later, their bodies are found out on German Church Road, deceased. There was some real controversy regarding the autopsy, and I don't mind saying I looked at a bunch of cases from that time period, and there was a coroner back there back at the time. We have a medical examiner now, which is an appointed position, and it's a medical doctor. At that time, coroner was an elected position. And there's a guy
Really?
there named Walter McCarran who was there for years, an elected guy. I have no idea what Walter's background or if he was a doctor or what he was, but what I do know about him was he was a grandstanding guy that liked to be in the press, and he would often just do things that I consider inappropriate, in talking about an investigation or homicide investigation. He called their deaths exposure, or said they basically froze to death. His chief investigator was a guy named Harry Gloss at the time, who publicly disputed that. Said no, they had, one of them had stab wounds. It doesn't make any sense. And McLaren fired him. And so that in itself, having the scene kind of messed up like that, causes problems
Were
from
the
the
boys
start.
stabbed?
They were beaten and choked. I don't recall whether they were choked. They were clearly homicides, listed as homicides. Their causes of death were homicide. I think, I don't recall if they were stabbed, but they were certainly beaten and choked. So so time goes by, and the thing is about this, if you think about it historically, which makes this interesting and difficult, is that time goes by, and up until the 90s, where ATF really gets an investigation going, looking at, I think it was all generated really by the Helen Brock disappearance. Helen Brock was the Brock Candies heiress, who was worth millions of dollars, who
Yeah.
disappeared in 1977, and her murder went unsolved for some time. And all of
Has it been?
this,
I don't know much about it. I know the candy. Has it ever been solved?
yes, it was all
Oh,
part of this case that ATF put together. And it wasn't just ATF. I don't want to slight anybody. Chicago police was involved, and I don't know if the FBI was or not. I don't recall
wasn't
now, but
Spilotro like peripherally involved with that or something?
it's certainly possible. So, you know, the Chicago outfit was always kind of peripherally involved in all of this horse stuff. I mean, again, Curtis Hanson was tied closely with Sam DiStefano or is alleged to have been, and Frankie Schweiss. Silas Jane was a bad man. Silas Jane either killed or tried to kill his own brother. They were just really good at scamming people with horses. They would go to Florida and buy beat up old worn out horses and pump them full of steroids and amphetamines and sell them to wealthy people in Barrington and in North Shore, Chicago, and then out west as prize ponies. And then when they get figured out, they threaten them, or it was just a big scam. And I'm not familiar enough with Helen Brock case to talk that much about it. But what happens as a result of that is the Schuster Peterson thing gets opened up, and then Hansen gets charged, right? So you're talking about 1993 to 1995. Up until that point, other than people saying that they're this weird that the Grime sisters thing had happened, there would have been no reason for anybody to kind of look at them being connected. And then with the Kenneth Hansen thing, what was of interest is when Curtis Hansen burned his stables down after. So they went to Curtis basically and said, "Hey, Kenneth killed these boys that are found out there." And Curtis knew his brother, Kenneth Hansen, was a pedophile and a lifelong kind of predator on kids, sexual predator kids. And he knew it. He didn't want to deal with it. He protected him, I think, a lot, well, whatever, because of his brother, but more because of his standing with the outfit and his businesses. He didn't want to hurt that. So he would kind of run interference for Kenneth. But to shorten this story a bit, when I was in Cold Case, we had looked extensively at the Judith Mae Anderson case, different. But my partner at the time was about to be timed out at the police department. At the Chicago Police Department, when you turn 63, you're forced off the job. 63 is the out time. And my partner, Jim, at the time was within about 6 weeks of that. And we had a lot of stuff going on. We had a lot of cases we worked on that we were trying to get closure on and get wrapped up. And some were close to either prosecution or clearing. And he came to me one day with the Grime sisters file and said, I got to look at this. And very frankly, I said, "Oh, yeah, you're out of your mind. We don't have enough time, buddy." And in these cases from the 50s, like in the Judith Mae Anderson case, there was 20,000 people interviewed in that case. And they would do these like single page Q&As on everybody they interviewed. And it was literally that. It would be a typewritten form on almost like onion skin, super thin paper.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, it would just say, "This is the interview by Detective Mike Hammond of subject such and such regarding this murder." And then it would be question, "What's your name?" Such and such. Q, "What's your name?" A, answer, "I'm Joe Schmo from whatever." And then question related to it. And there were thousands and thousands of those on Judith Mae Anderson. It was endless trying to work through all of that. And the Grime sisters were exactly the same, except that their bodies were found in unincorporated Cook County, so it was actually Cook County Sheriff's murder. We just had the missing, but we had the Chicago Police Department file. So Jim says, "I got to look at it. I grew up over there. The case kind of affected me, as a kid growing up, and I got to look through it before I leave." I'm like, "All right, brother. Well, have at it. I'm going to work on everything else." And Jim is a meticulous, really smart guy. He'd been a college professor before he got in the police department. He's a Vietnam vet, and he's just the kind of guy that. When I'd ask him to correct my reports, look my reports over, it was for substance, to make sure I hadn't made any mistake in my reports. And Jim would come back, say, "You need a comma here. You didn't, okay, all right." I mean, he's just a very meticulous, sharp guy. And so he'd sit and read these reports over and over in these Q&As. And a few weeks later, he comes in and he sets up a Q&A, old time Q&A on my desk. And he says, "I want you to read that. Tell me what you think. And this is literally the way that happened. And it was the interview of a guy named Dennis Mitchell, who's just lost to history. He died. He's since died. But he was interviewed because he had been at the Brighton Park Theater on the night that the Grime sisters disappeared. And I don't know how they found him. There was no reports to indicate how they came across Dennis Mitchell. If they just, I have no idea. But there it was. And it said, yes, I was at the Brighton Park Theater. Where were you at this date? Do you know the Grime sisters? No, I don't know them, whatever. And what movie were you at? I was at the late show of the Love Me Tender, Elvis Presley movie. Okay. Were you alone or were you with somebody? I was with somebody. Who were you with? My boss from the horse stables, Kenneth Hansen. And I read that and I'm like, literally, I said to Jim, you got to be shitting me. I mean, this can't be real. And he said, no, man, keep reading it. And he goes through and he explains he works for Hansen horse stables in Willow Springs, I believe it's Willow Springs, Illinois, and which is out there, right? Same property, basically, near where they were found. And it just was, I don't even know how you, again, the shocking thing about that was, how could that have fallen through? Well, there had been no reason to look at it at all until the mid-90s when ATF, and Red Wilmette get together and start talking about this. And then who'd have thought then to connect that Curtis Hanson had opened another stable, and it was buried in all these reports. It was just a very, very just a needle in a haystack. And Jim was just sharp enough to find it. And so we started looking at, first we tried to find Mitchell. He was dead. So we found his brother in Michigan. We went and talked to him, and he just had no recollection of his brother's activity back then. It wasn't helpful. But we talked to the Cook County Sheriff's cold case unit, started working with them. There was some evidence that was suggested was available that had been worked up actually by the Illinois State Police Crime Lab, but then that evidence couldn't be found because Hanson's DNA, because he was in prison from the 90s until the day he died, isn't in the system. But that case remains ongoing, and I know the sheriff is still looking on it. But
so he was not convicted of killing the girls?
Nope. He was never charged.
How did he get to the girls, as an example, if he's got this guy with him?
Well,
maybe the guy was involved.
There's only speculation. I mean, first of all, you have to ask yourself the question, what are the chances that Kenneth Hansen, who at the time wasn't known to be, a year after the Schuster-Peterson boys, but as it turns out, is a killer of young children. What is the chances that he ends up in a movie theater with these girls and he is not involved with their disappearance and murder? You know what I mean? It's
no, you lost me a little bit though. The boys were found where, and the girls were found where? I'm sorry.
The boys, the Schuster's brothers and the Peterson boy, the three of them were found in a forest preserve, which is like a park area, forested park area on the northwest side of Chicago.
Okay.
So relative to, if you wrapping your head around it, if you're not from Chicago, not too far from O'Hare Field, not also that close, but same direction out that way.
And where were the girls?
The girls were found on German Church Road in unincorporated Cook County, in the west suburbs. So probably 15 miles at least from where the boys were found.
By the way, I think that I'm discussing a different case. The book Two Boys Found may have happened much earlier than that. And I think they stuffed them in down in a gutter. It was similar to the Leopold and Loeb case. And put them in a gutter, poor Bobby Franks, I guess is who people, they shoved him in a water drain or something.
Yeah.
And in that case, the end result was they didn't know what serial killers. They didn't have they didn't believe in it. They just thought, well, murders him. But now, of course, we know there are such things as serial killers.
Yeah.
So I think it's two different
Yeah,
things.
it could be.
Let me ask you something. How much do you know? Do we have time to? Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah, of course. That's me. Anything you like.
How well do you know anything about the background on these Hansons?
Well, basically what I've told you. I know Curtis was the other thing that came out in discussions. We're at the 10-minute mark now. Curtis Hanson was also alleged to have been a pornographer. May have made some pornographic films. There was some talk, again, just conversation. Now, Red would be the guy to talk to about this, to be frank.
We're going to have to get Red up here.
Yeah, I mean, he's a real good, and I've heard him say that he doesn't buy the Hanson connection to the Grime sisters. And I'd be interested to know why he thinks that is, because he may have a real good reason, but it just seems impossible. What my suspicion is that, and I'm going way out of a limb here, but just to make a jump, this has been true since I read all of this. I believe that Kenneth probably talks these girls into coming out there. Hey, you want to come out and ride the horses? Or we got a horse stable. They come out there, and then Curtis probably is the guy that's involved with something happened to him because of the pornographic film thing that he was into. Something happens out there at those horse stables where those girls can no longer, or can be allowed to go home. And so, but there's a lot of speculation there, right? I'm way out there on a dive.
The reason I was asking is you've got who's the mob? What Hanson's is the mob guy?
Curtis was tied with
Curtis is
DiStefano and yeah, Curtis. Kenneth was a kind of effeminate by accounts of guys. I knew the guys arrested him, and they said
I've been told by policemen and by bad guys that when he came into a room, they called him Lurch. He came in a room, they made an excuse to leave, but he was creepy, he was scary, he would stare at people, he would unnerve them. I mean, obviously there was something seriously wrong with this guy. And then we've got the brother who was a pedophile, a murderer. What the hell happened in their life? I mean, you and I know, agree that all of this stems from the home life that they're.
Yeah.
So what the hell happened to these people?
Yeah, good question. It's all speculation. I don't know. You could probably get there if there's anybody left to talk to. Another thing about Kenneth, which is very disturbing, and he had a wife that died, she allegedly hung herself, and the autopsy called it a suicide. I'm talking about Kenneth, no, not Curtis. Kenneth, the pedophile, and according to the autopsy, her body was bruised up. In general, you cannot generalize. You got to be careful with this. But hanging is not a common way, especially back in the day that women took their own life. And with the bruising and that, it's very suspicious. Curtis was a connected guy. It's just a very ugly thing.
Let me ask you.
Guys. Now, let me remark real quick. I never heard all that about. We got 6 minutes left here, just to be clear. But I never heard about. I heard Curtis was a dangerous dude and kind of an insufferable guy. The guy who it sounds like you're talking about is what was his name? Larry Miller out there, who was part of Spilatro's crew.
You know what? You might be right. You might be right. Yeah, he was.
They called him Lurch, and he was a fearsome.
So my
probably
mistake.
close to serial killer himself.
You
He
know, I
was,
don't know Curtis Hanson. I'm gonna have to look it up. I don't. I've not come across the guy.
yeah, he was a dangerous guy, and he was connected, and he had all kinds of scams going, and there's talk of him doing open contract murders, and that yeah, he was known to be a bad guy. Now
Do I have time
Kenneth, his brother.
to ask you a quick one? You know, I know
Sure, of
Red.
course.
We've talked, and
Yeah.
I consider him a friend. But what? How come I thought he was working in a bookstore and the monster came along and then threatened him. Blah, blah, blah. So apparently he before that he was hooked up in those circles. Is that right?
You talking about Red?
Yeah.
Yeah, Red. We actually, my partner Jim and I talked to him because the ATF guy, who had worked closely with Red, um, when we were looking at that Grime sisters case, the ATF agent said, "Hey, you need to talk to Red. Well, he really knows this stuff." And we called him. He's down in Florida, and Jim really talked to him. But Red had been cooperating since the '70s with the feds. He just he was part of that. There
How
was
long did
among
he
the other
cooperate? Do you know?
20 years or so, I think.
Wow.
I mean,
Really?
I think he'd be real forthright about that. He does a podcast, I know, and I don't want to speak for him. I think he'd be real forthcoming with all of that. But
Yeah.
we talk that Chicago's such an amazing place. You had all these wars going on. The chop shop wars where Couture was killed. The horse mafia wars. There was also the Frankie, which you're familiar with a little bit. The porn shop wars
Right.
that Frankie Schweiss kind of flexed and took control over, and
I'm
Red
working
when
on that
met saw
now.
that.
I'll have a story out in
Yeah,
about a week.
that's
Gonski and all
interesting
those
stuff.
guys.
And I think when Met saw some stuff early on, and that he thought this is just wrong. There are people getting hurt here that shouldn't be getting hurt, and he decided to
Yeah.
become cooperative. And again, I don't need to speak for him. I don't really know him, but yeah, but he's the guy that is the genesis of all these cases coming together.
How are we doing? We've got 3 minutes.
3 minutes, yes, sir.
So that's interesting. So it's still open, though, the case. It's still a cold case,
Case is
but
still open, still open.
shouldn't there be a designation for middle ground? Like, all right, this is open, but we're pretty sure.
Yeah, well, we just call them cold cases. The thing about murders that we like, I mean, that's an unfortunate way to say that, but as a homicide detective, especially working in cold case, murders never go away. They go cold. They're assigned a cold case. They put it in the file back, but they never go away. New information, and if you kill somebody, you got to live with that until the day you walk away from the earth, because somebody's always looking. We're always looking, and these are good examples, these cases. And I saw one somewhere in the country, they solved one 60 years old, the guy's still
It's
alive.
amazing. Yeah.
That's what I want to see, because
Yeah. It's
especially when
amazing.
they're kids or innocent people, it's like, those cases should get justice. And the families are often alive. And I'll tell you, in that Judith Mae Anderson thing, we got about 2 minutes here. I'll let you finish, but her brothers are still alive. And it was stark talking to them, because really the clock stopped for them the day she was murdered. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can clearly see it in both of them, that their lives just were never the same. It was a
Yeah.
painful conversations, but it also, it gives you some motivation, because you'd like to find answers for them.
Sure. Yeah,
Can't
of course.
always do it, but you'd like to.
All right, we'll do another one.
Okay, that'd be
All
great.
right.
I
Thanks for
appreciate it.
talking to me. I'm
My
going to have to
pleasure.
figure out how to turn this off now. But
Okay, very good. Nice
yeah,
talking to you.
baby boomers go technical.
Yeah, thank you.
All
I
right, I'll see
appreciate
you soon.
it. Okay.